All right, well, welcome to everyone. I'll convene our regular meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission for Tuesday, July 26, 2022. Thanks to all those who are here. First item on our agenda is the agenda. Are there any changes to it?
We do have a couple of changes to the agenda, Andy.
Okay.
We've made a couple changes to the public art item. Those are noted in the packet that you all were sent for the meeting about an hour ago. Some additional changes, I believe.
Charles, you fade in and out when you're speaking.
Okay, I'm using a new system. I was hoping it'd be better. Let me see if I can change that up. Andy, the other change that I want to note is that on item 7, organizational meeting, the appointment of commission clerk states that it should be Charles Dillard, and in fact, it should be Bridget O'Keefe.
Okay. Oh, yeah, Megan.
We do have one additional item for you, Andy. If the commission will entertain potentially after item number 6, we did have a change to a zoning amendment that you had passed on to the council previously yesterday. So we need to review that with you and give you the opportunity to update the municipal bylaw amendment report.
Okay, and what's the title for that item?
It's ZA 2205, and that is the Burlington High School zoning amendment.
Okay. So we'll add that on. Back to item 6, the public art one. Was there a change to the agenda, or was that just a change to the information?
No, it's just a change to the information. Sorry.
Great, no problem. Any other changes to our agenda? Then we have our agenda as amended. Item 2 is the public forum. This is an opportunity for the members of the public to speak to the commission pretty much on any item that you would like. We do have 2 public hearings, and if you want to speak to one of those, we'd encourage you to wait until the public hearing, but if you don't have time for that, certainly welcome to speak now. Charles, do we have anyone who wants to speak during the public forum?
We do. It looks like we have at least 2 who would like to speak. We'll start with Sharon Busher, but before we go to Sharon, I'll ask that if you are attending the meeting and you would like to speak, please press the raise hand icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll add you to the queue. But again, we're going to start with Sharon Busher. So Sharon, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Andy, this is a question for you and the meeting. My comments are really specific to Trinity rezoning, and I would potentially, I could make those at the time you take that up. I would look to you as to how you want me to handle those comments.
Sharon, it's your choice. You could do it either now, or I'll give an opportunity during that item for people to speak as well. So your choice.
So I will make more detailed comments at the Trinity rezoning item, but I just wanted to call your attention to the fact that I sent a communication. It didn't get in your original packet, but it was sent with the additional supplemental information. I did send it at the end of last week, and there were some specific questions. The one thing that I will say, besides the request for a site visit by you and staff, is that when you're making these considerations, I think that everyone needs to recall that the Redstone campus is a much larger land mass and not a good comparable when making decisions about whether to even address density, etc. So I'll leave it at that. But there are specifics that I asked made reference to. There were requests and comments in my communication. The second item is when you get to it, I would like to speak about what happened at the ordinance committee of the city council regarding the rezoning of the high school, and would like to make a comment specific to that when you get to that item. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sharon.
Andy, our next speaker will be Amy Magyar, who is in the Sharon Busher conference room.
Great, thank you.
Hi, this is Amy Magyar, and it looks like I may be one of the only people here in terms of speaking on behalf of folks that have received a B&B permit in the past, B&B specifically. There just seems to be some confusion as we roll out the short-term rental regulations in terms of how these new regulations may actually affect us. Realizing, I think everybody sort of had a wake-up call that we would have to register yearly and jump through sort of yearly hoops. It just based on the FAQ that went out, there's just some confusion as to sort of what happens with B&B. We know that that term is going away, but people that have that permit coming in, it just sounds like there's some clarification that needs to happen. How we're affected by the 9%, how we're affected by inspections, how we're affected by annual registration. Some things that maybe wouldn't have happened or didn't happen prior to that. So I think everybody just wants to make sure that they're in line and doing everything that they need to do, but it's just a smidge confusing on that side. But that's basically it. Just happy to be here in person finally.
Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker will go to Barbara Hedrick.
Barbara, welcome. You're on mute if you're trying to
Okay.
speak.
There we go. So I would like to talk first about Trinity. There's the area in the very back of the lot called the cottages, and UVM has sort of quickly passed over that to say, well, we'll figure that out later. But, you know, given the location of those behind where the proposed buildings are going to be, it seems like those should be built out now for two reasons. One, we want UVM to maximize the number of housing beds it builds sooner rather than later. And two, it would be easier to access that property before all the new buildings go up. So I'd like you to go circle back, please, to UVM and see why can't those dorms be constructed now. Moving on, I did listen very carefully to your conversation in the last meeting where you talked about how it'd be great to have a grocery store to a coffee shop on the Trinity campus so people could walk rather than drive to these retail operations. And some people, mentioned the retail operations in the Davis Center and the hospital. But I just want to point out that when you have street frontage retail that's geared to bringing the public in, for example, like a Trader Joe's or a Starbucks, that's very different from what you have in the Davis Center, where it's not visible from the street and it's primarily geared towards serving students, although the public can go in there. A Trader Joe's or a Starbucks on campus is facing a street is a very different type of retail business operation. So I think that given that the institutional zoning code as it's currently written tells the DRB to ignore noise and traffic impacts, if we're going to allow the university to have commercial operations that are geared to helping the public in general and street frontage, then I think that noise and traffic impacts should be considered as part of the DRB review. I think a DRB review should always be required because that's the last line of defense a neighborhood has for getting UVM to tell us the truth, the full truth, and to add conditions to the permit so that UVM doesn't abuse the adjacent neighborhood. And three, if commercial retail operations are actually going to happen on campus, I think there's perfect rationale to tax those properties and those businesses as though they were on off campus. because in my opinion, where the campus kitchen is the place to put a grocery store and the Starbucks. I don't see why it can't be across Colchester Avenue rather than on campus and use the campus land to maximize the number of student beds. So I ask you please to make noise and traffic considered for any commercial operations, and also to tax the building and the property as though it was an off-campus property. Third, we haven't talked a lot about it, but it came up in Megan's pitch, is that idea of not having UVM build parking but instead do structured parking. I want to suggest that structured parking should be at the Jeffords lot. It should be near the intersection of I-89 and Spear Street and Main Street, so that traffic does not come into the city. And the primary reason is because UVM has in its plans for the expanded athletic campus venues, the PFG complex, 7,000 person events, 11,000 person events, 17,000 persons on the athletic campus at one time. So it's going to be a huge number of people. And by having structured parking at the Jeffords lot, and they could put it underground like the hospital, it's going to be convenient to UVM visitors coming, which it's hard to do TDM for visitors. And then last, I just want to point out that, I've been watching very carefully your work on the min-max parking zoning amendment. And when talking about parking for UVM, that's very different from talking about parking for a new housing or development site. Because a builder will build enough parking in order to serve its tenants, but UVM, given the chance, will dump all its parking into the city because it would rather use its campus land for other things. And there's nothing to compel UVM to not take the cheapest approach possible, and that is not to build parking and not to do remote satellite lots. So I ask you to please think creatively about ways to require UVM to finally do what we've been asking them to do for a long time, which is use UVM shuttles to bring people in from their the surrounding communities and bring them into Burlington so that their cars stay at home and don't come into the city. And that way it helps the environment and reduces the need for parking. And it helps, it's consistent, this is my last point, it's consistent with Article 8 of CEDO, which is UVM has the responsibility to keep its parking supply and demand in balance. So I don't want us to upset that requirement by saying, don't build UVM any parking, and then they say, well, then I'm going to just use the city streets for my employee and student parking. Thanks so much for listening to all that.
Thank you, Barbara. Charles, do we
Andy,
have it?
We've got a couple other members of the public here, but I think they're just observing. So I think that's it for our speakers today.
All right, great, thank you. So we'll move on to item 3, which is chair's report, and I don't have anything tonight to report. So item 4 is the director's report. Megan.
All right. Thank you, Andy. I think I just wanted to add one more note for the commissioners. As we amended our agenda, we sent you an email before the meeting tonight also to let you know that and share with you a revised agenda packet. That includes things like the communication that Sharon Busher mentioned had been sent after the agenda was posted, as well as some of the revised materials for the topics that are on your agenda for tonight. So we'll be referring to and can happily share the screen for that document as well if it would be helpful. And just wanted to make sure that the commission knew that. As far as updates, I wanted to share, if you haven't already heard, that this Friday morning is the inaugural, or is it fair to call it inaugural, the return trip of Amtrak, leaving from the Burlington waterfront at Union Station, traveling to New York City. So if you're available and you're interested, you're all invited to the kind of ribbon cutting ceremony that will be happening at Union Station starting at 8:30 on Friday morning. There will be a series of speakers and other events happening before the first train departs at 10 in the morning, headed to Bridgend. So very exciting moment for our region to have that train service connected, bringing Burlington another connection to New York City. Another event that we thought you might be interested in is actually one that our office is planning. In the evening on August 11th, we will be showing a film as part of the BCA Flicks in the Park series at City Hall Park. We're going to be showing the documentary that is called Owned, which talks about a number of housing issues and challenges that kind of affect the housing market nationally and in various communities around the country. So we're actually showing this film kind of as a start to our public education and engagement that we will be doing this fall for the Missing Middle Project. So we'll share a more detailed link to that for you as soon as it's ready, but wanted you to just save the date in case you're interested in joining for that. We have a number of zoning amendments that I wanted to provide a quick update for you on. You heard during public forum, Amy referenced the implementation of the short-term rental ordinance. And I know that this is something that Scott's team and others in the city have been communicating about on a regular basis since the city council adopted the changes to chapter 18. Those ordinances are intended to come into effect next Wednesday, and we have a lot of FAQs and that we have published and more that we can work through to help answer questions that people are working on. But just wanted to let you know that after many long years of work, those are slated to be in effect next week. At their meeting on Monday night, the council also voted to warn the maximum parking and transportation demand management amendment that you spent time on earlier this year. That'll go to a public hearing on August 15th. And because of our warning deadlines, will also be in effect starting tomorrow when the notice appears in the paper for that public hearing. So that is, again, the implementation or the expansion of the removal of minimum on-site parking requirements and the implementation of maximum limits, as well as the expansion of the TDM standards. So council, in warning that, did not opt to make any changes to the proposed expansion of the TDM requirements as part of that ordinance. Council Ordinance Committee met twice this month and talked about the steep slopes amendment and the BHS zoning amendment. Both of them will be going to public hearing at their August meeting as well, and we'll talk about the change that they made to the BHS amendment at the end or later in your agenda. And then a couple of other things. I know that Charles and Bruce met to talk about resuming Planning Commission Ordinance Committee meetings. So I believe the intention is for them to have a meeting next week in August. And we'll kick off with talking about some topics that Bruce brought to Charles for consideration. And then we've also been talking with Scott and others in CEDO just about how the implementation of the changes to our inclusionary zoning ordinance have been going. The commissioners, those of you who have been around for a couple of years may remember that in 2019, you were part of an effort to kind of comprehensively update our inclusionary ordinance. And now that we have had several projects go through the process, the permitting process under those revised standards, we are flagging some areas of opportunity for us to provide some additional clarification. So we've been talking with Scott and CEDO about how to do that. So that's something that you'll likely see in your next few meetings. And I think in the interest of time, I'll stop there and turn it back over to you, Andy.
Great, thank you, Megan. So we'll close that and move on to item 5, which is a public hearing for proposed ZA-22-08 short-term rentals. And Megan or Scott or Charles, who's going to introduce this one?
Oh, I can pipe in. If it gets complicated, I'll pass the buck to Megan. So you've seen this amendment before. And in fact, you've approved it for city council before. The long story short is that continued debate at the city council level around the standards in chapter 18 basically led to the zoning amendment expiring. Right, under the statute, zoning amendments have a year from referral from the planning commission for the city council to act. Well, a year came and went. So this is the same thing, take two. This just does some cleanup in the CDO as to short-term rentals. We define it and refer to the standards in 18. And we also clean up our lodging definition. And that's it.
Great, thank you. So let's open up the public hearing. Is there any member of the public who'd like to speak to this item? Charles, do we have anyone who is interested? Do you know?
We've got two hands raised. It's Sharon and Barbara. Sharon, I will unmute you. If you would like to speak, go ahead. If you would like not to, just go ahead and unraise your hand.
I didn't plan on speaking, but I'll say nice job. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon.
Thanks, Sharon.
And
And-
Barbara, did you want to speak to this one, or were you just, is your hand just still raised from before? Looks like her hand might still just be raised from before.
I'll lower them just so that way it's clear.
And was there anyone else?
Does not appear that there's anybody else, Andy.
Great, thanks. So we'll close the public hearing. I'll just say, as Scott explained, what's before us, I think, is really the same zoning change as what we did before. What's different is what the council did in chapter 18, but that's really not part of the zoning amendment. That's just the ordinances that put in the different standards under the zoning code. Am I saying that right, Scott?
Yes.
So any comments from the commission or questions, or are you ready to take action? Anyone want to do a motion to recommend approval, to forward this to the council and recommend approval with the municipal bylaw amendment?
I'd like to ask Scott how often we discuss something and then it expires so that we have to come back and do it again. Like the process is just mildly protracted. Do you have any percentages on that, Mr. Guston?
I could not give you a percentage. This is not the only time it's happened. I can think of probably 3 times that it's happened.
At least since I've been here. Andy, I'd like to make a motion that we forward this with the accompanying report to the city council for approval.
Okay, with a recommendation for approval from the council
Yeah.
to the council. Perfect.
That-
All right.
Okay.
So we have a motion by Alex. Is there a second? Seconded by Emily. Any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion, say aye or raise your hand. Aye. Any opposed? Doesn't look like there's any opposition, so that passes unanimously. Great, thank you. Now we're on to item 6, which is public hearing for proposed ZA-22-09, public art.
All right,
Who's going to-
Andy, I will go ahead and introduce this one, and Scott was part of the ordinance committee discussion with this one, so he can add any detail that's needed. Just one second. So prior to the adoption of the downtown form code, there was guidance in the ordinance related to public art. However, when the downtown code was adopted, that language went away essentially. So there's no sort of regulating language in the ordinance today related to public art. The previous standards did address public art in a few ways. It offered bonus height provisions in exchange for public art that qualified. It permitted public art as an acceptable encroachment in the required waterfront setback and provided some standards and guidance related to funding, location, and maintenance. Obviously, if you've read Plan BTV and if you've lived in Burlington, you know that art and public art specifically is incredibly important to the character of the community. And as such, a zoning amendment is proposed to define public art and also prescribe some standards related to its display and erection. So the proposed zoning amendment does provide a definition that is fairly broad, encompasses many types of art media. And some changes that were made today, actually, that were not included in the packet that you were sent last week, address some sort of some legal language, specifically, and there's two portions of section 19 on the second page of this item in your agenda packet. Essentially, we provided some additional language such that public art on private property shall not be required to obtain a zoning permit. And if the art does not meet the standards as described below this line, it simply should not be constructed, erected, or displayed. The second change that was made after your packet was sent and that you were sent later today addresses the sort of legal language, and we needed to sort of clarify that. So I'll just read 19B that's highlighted in your packet. So the specific installation shall not be obscene, threatening based on characteristics that are protected under anti-discrimination laws, represent hate, or contain fighting words or incite violence. We have reviewed this with the city attorney's office, and Kim Sturdivant is here if you would like to ask her any questions, but that is essentially the summary of the changes that were made today. But essentially, again, this is to define and identify some standards for public art in the ordinance.
Thank you. When with that, we'll open up the public hearing for the public art zoning, proposed zoning amendment. Charles, do we have anyone who'd like to speak during this item?
We do not, Andy.
All right, then we'll close the public hearing and back on to the commission. Any questions, comments? Are you ready to make a motion to advance this to the council? Anyone? Emily?
Yep.
Okay,
Motion to move this to the council.
with the bylaw
Report and the bylaws,
and a recommendation for approval.
I suppose, a recommendation for approval.
All right, sounds good. Motion by Emily and a second by Michael. Any further discussion? See none. All those in favor of the motion, say aye or raise your hand. Any opposed? Good. Again, it looks like that passes unanimously. So now we're on to our next item, which is the Burlington High School zoning amendment, which was amended onto our agenda tonight. So who would like to take this item up?
I can cover this item, Andy. And I am also happy to share my screen if it's helpful. So in the amended packet that we sent out to you, we attached at the very end a communication that includes the ordinance for the Burlington High School zoning amendment. So that's ZA 2205. From your discussions, you may remember that we covered things like height, setback, lot coverage, uses, etc. for the high school campus. And our package included a number of maps that helped make the change to rezone the property from the RCO district into the institutional district with its overlay. When the City Council Ordinance Committee discussed this amendment, one of the items that they spent some time discussing was the appropriate parking district for the high school property to be located in. The parking district that the school is currently located in is the neighborhood parking district, which has the most permissive parking standards. Well, has the highest minimum on-site parking requirements today, but under our pending maximum parking ordinance, will have the most permissive maximum parking limits. After some discussion, the ordinance committee felt that it was more appropriate for that campus to be located in the multimodal mixed-use parking district, which has the most restrictive maximum parking limits. In order to help facilitate development on the campus in a way that embraces the kind of multimodal goals, the reduction of VMT and single occupant vehicle traffic or utilization. And one of the counselors was also interested in ensuring that the city was sort of embracing and living up to the standards that we're asking of other large developments in the city. So the change that the council ordinance committee made was to include an additional map in that amendment that shows the rezoning of the high school property from the neighborhood parking district to the multimodal mixed-use district. And also includes some additional language in the description of where the multimodal mixed-use district is to ensure that it's clear that those properties are included in that district as well. And again, if it would be helpful to pull up a map, I'm happy to do so if anybody wants to see that.
Sure, that could be helpful.
Okay. All right. So this is the bulk of the amendment language here. At the end of the amendment here, there used to be some text when it got referred from the commission that said where you see 8.1.3 parking districts. The version that you had sent on to them previously said that the parking standards could be applied according to whatever district the majority of a building's mass was in, because currently the high school property is split by the neighborhood district and the multimodal mixed-use district. And the school district had suggested that language as a way to just resolve and clarify how they may calculate parking changes. So the ordinance committee replaced that language simply by replacing it with this language here that says that the properties that the high school is located at are in the multimodal mixed-use parking district. And then here towards the end, as I scroll down, there is an additional map right here. This is map 8.1 or 8.1.3-1, which is our parking district map. And you can see here that the two parcels that the school is located on are outlined in red to be changed from neighborhood to multimodal mixed use. So the reason that these are coming to the Planning Commission, this doesn't happen very often. So especially for newer commissioners, when the City Council makes changes to an amendment, the changes do not have to come back to you for discussion and a new public hearing. But the changes come back to you to make sure that you're informed, to give you the opportunity to make any comments about those changes if you would like. And ultimately, statute requires that you reapprove the municipal bylaw amendment report. So the amendment report has just been updated to reflect the fact that this change has been made to the ordinance.
Okay, thank you. Any questions or comments for Megan? Michael?
What's the net change, I guess? The parking maximum, what does it go from to?
Roughly, the school district has been planning for parking conceptually at this stage for a building that includes about 80 classrooms. The parking calculations for the schools are based on classroom count. So the change from neighborhood to multimodal mixed use reduces the maximum limit from about 720 spaces to 400. It's a pretty significant decrease. The school district did provide some information both to me in advance of the meeting and also to the ordinance committee, just citing, that it was their strong preference that the district remain in the neighborhood parking, the property remain in the neighborhood parking district. They've also provided some information that indicates that their current planning has them kind of at a regular kind of use basis at under 400 spaces. So their main concern is about accommodating event parking for things like track meets or performances, et cetera, which they host regularly. I think the council ordinance committee heard those concerns and felt that the TDM process and the ability to seek a waiver from the maximum limits could give them flexibility to plan for their parking needs.
So at the minimum, Megan, what we need to do is approve the amended report.
That's correct.
Any other questions or comments from the commission? Is there?
Andy, there is a hand from Sharon Busher. She had indicated that she wanted to speak on this item, and Scott also has his hand up.
Oh, great. Okay. Let's go to Sharon and then to Scott.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I respected the school's request. My children went to BHS. My daughter was very involved with athletics. Also, I'm well aware of what the old auditorium did as far as use for community events beyond school events. And I was incredibly concerned about this change from a potential of 720 spaces to 400. I was really concerned about things like track meets. And there was a reference that, as Megan referenced, that, you know, the city should comply just like the city property should comply, just like private developers. I think there's a big difference between a residential development where you have a planned number of people with potentially some spaces for visitors, but you're not going to have big events at those residential communities. Whereas this this is our school. This is a vital place where people come to gather, and track meets are not internal to Burlington. They're regional. They're from around the state, and they attract a lot of people. And I do believe that you can impose TDM on Burlington, but I feel that what this may do is really put Burlington out of the mix of hosting some of these big events. I don't know, everyone was talking about waivers, but I think that there's a limit. I mean, you could have a waiver of up to maybe 50%. I don't know what the waiver is, but I don't feel that this is really taking into consideration all of the things that happen at a school, and it's putting a constraint on parking. It is talking about the parking for the current plan, and yet you're zoning for potential growth, and that growth they wouldn't be able to have any more additional spaces. I don't really understand. I care definitely about the climate, and I'm not going to go off on that tangent, but I do believe that there are multiple factors that impact the climate, and it's not just people gathering for these large events. I feel very strongly about this. I feel the students of Burlington have been put through a lot, and I don't want to tie their hands so that they won't be able to host events and won't be able to have community events. We don't do that to UVM. Why should we do it to our high school? I feel very passionate about this, and I'm very upset that people who didn't grow up in this community are making these decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And Scott, did you want to speak on this as well?
Yeah, just a very minor detail. I think I see a typo on page 54 of the packet, page 4 of the high school amendment under section 813. It's a new wording under A-G. It says the parking district also includes the properties located and 0 and 52 Institute I think that first "and" should be an "at."
That is a great catch. That's correct.
Okay, that'd be great to make that change. Any other questions or comments from the commission? Michael?
I guess this just one, I suppose all we can do is really comment on it anyway, but it does feel like another one where I don't know, I just don't feel like the data's there one way or another. We have spent a decent amount of time talking about capacity issues with UVM events, which seems to be a concern for people. And this also would seem to follow that same path if you're looking for consistency amongst city policies. But I think regardless, it doesn't matter. I have like no idea whether 700 or 400 spots is appropriate or forces people's hand at TDM, because I have no idea how many people are going to fit in the auditorium or how many people attend a track meet. So it's really very difficult to comment one way or the other.
And I would, I'll get to you just one sec. I would encourage people who have comments on this to go to this council, because that's really where this is right now. But Emily?
Yeah, I think, we need to be planning for a parking system where we share our resources. And so designing the high school to be ready for a peak parking event that happens, let's say there's 10 major events like that a year. We need to come up with a different solution than huge surface parking lots that are empty most of the year and water drains off of and creates stormwater issues. So I know where you're coming from, Sharon, and honor and appreciate the history and knowledge that you have on the council, but I disagree with you on this. I think we actually need to build less parking at the high school and really start looking at other ways of sharing a community resource, whether it's shuttling people from the shopping center that is down the street, or shared parking for other garages and places that are not being utilized at that time.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, so do we have a motion to approve the revised bylaw report, and or if anyone wants to have comments sent to the council? I'm not sure if there are, it doesn't sound like it, but this would be the opportunity to do that.
I mean, I feel like at least, I'm sorry, Andy, if I.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like, I mean, perhaps council did this, so I just don't know, and perhaps staff could let us know. The trouble I have is, and maybe again this was done, but 400 units or 400 spaces may be too many. Like, I don't know what the peak, what the capacity needs is. So I suppose I would, but Megan, maybe you can tell us if council had that data before making this decision, because it could be that really you only need to accommodate X number of technical school students and X number of teachers, and the number is actually lower. Like, it seems a bit out of the air.
The data that the council ordinance committee had from the school district was that for their sort of daily needs, they're planning for just under 400 spaces. I think they said somewhere around 360 at this point in time. And that would cover the kind of day-to-day users, the faculty, staff, student body that they anticipate parking. Again, this is very conceptual, I should say. They did not have a specific number for the council ordinance committee in terms of what they expected their peak demand numbers to be. And they didn't, I don't remember, and Sharon could correct me, I don't remember them citing a specific number of events either that they were concerned about, or days of the year that they were concerned about. I think that in some ways their planning is kind of still in the premature phases for them to know those details specifically. They did talk about the fact that events currently can draw thousands of users. They can be from a couple of hours to an entire day. But I don't think that the data they provided to the council ordinance committee was conclusive enough to say that between the waiver process and other creative solutions that the district mentioned that they might be looking into. I think they're actually gonna be talking to Scott's team about next week for potentially building some impermanent overflow parking solutions. I don't think the council ordinance committee felt that they heard enough to suggest that there wasn't still gonna be an opportunity for the district's needs to be met.
Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else? We still need a motion on at least the bylaw report, the revised bylaw report. Is there a motion to approve that?
Motion.
Okay, thank you.
Approve the
Motion by
bylaw.
Mike. Motion by Michael to approve the amended bylaw report. Is there a second? Seconded by Emily. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion say aye or raise your hand. Aye. Any opposed? That's unanimous. Great, thank you. Then we're on to our item 7, which is the annual organizational meeting where we elect our new chair and vice chair, committee, at-large committee, and other committees. And Megan, I'm going to pass this on to you to do this item.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, our first nomination for the evening is the election of officers for chair and vice chair. We'll start with the chair. Are there any nominations for chair? Bruce?
I'll nominate Andy.
Okay, Andy's been nominated.
I
Andy,
second
would you
that
accept?
nomination.
Okay,
To second it, or,
I don't think we need seconds.
okay,
That's okay, thank you.
Let me know.
Andy, are you willing to accept that nomination?
Yes, I am. It's been an honor to serve as chair, and I would be happy to continue to do that.
All right. Are there any other nominations for chair? All right, and we'll move to a vote. All those in favor of Andy as the chair, please say aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
All right, that appears to be unanimous, Andy. Would you like me to turn it back over for the rest of this, or do you want me to keep going?
Oh, you can keep going if you'd like.
Okay. All right, we'll move on to nominations for vice chair then. Are there any nominations for vice chair? Michael,
Well, I would like to nominate Emily either for vice chair or at-large member of the executive committee. I'm not sure what she might be interested in, but regardless, I'd like to make that nomination because I think both serve as members of the executive committee.
I'll go for at-large member. How about that?
okay. So then are there,
I'm gonna nominate Bruce for vice chair then, to knock
Okay.
your nomination out.
all right, so there's a nomination for Bruce as vice chair. Are you accepting of that?
Sure.
All right, Bruce accepts. Any other nominations for vice chair? All right, seeing none, we'll go to a vote. All those in favor? Aye, or raise your hand. Okay, that appears unanimous. We also have a member of the public who voted in favor, so, you know, just so,
Let me itch my head.
just so you know, oh, okay.
Yay!
All right, so then we will go to appointment of the commission clerk, and as Charles had noted, that should actually read Bridget O'Keefe, who's been doing your minutes for you. All those in favor of appointment of Bridget as commission clerk? Please say aye or raise your hand. All right. We'll move on to committees, and actually, we do not have executive committee on here, so let's start with executive committee. This does include the chair and vice chair and one at-large member, so we'll take a nominate, oh, I'm sorry, it is here. We'll take a nomination for the at-large member of the executive committee. Michael,
I'd like to nominate Emily to serve as the at-large member of the executive committee.
based
I'll
on our
accept.
discussion. All right, great.
Thanks, Michael.
Any other nominations? All right, all those in favor of Emily as the at-large, please raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
That is unanimous. Andy, just let me know if you want to jump back in here.
Doing a great job.
All right, so we'll move on to our long range planning committee. For those of you that are newer, our long range planning committee has not met in a few years. They typically meet on an as needed basis when we're doing larger long range planning projects. But we do appoint a committee annually in case we need their services. So this includes one member of our executive committee and 2 at-large members. We also include a member from the DRB and the Conservation Board. Neither of those boards have held their organizational meetings yet, so we'll update you with volunteers from those boards when they do. But are there nominations for the Long Range Planning Committee, or people that are interested, I should say? Michael, are you nominating yourself, or? Yeah, okay,
I can nominate Michael.
okay. Yeah, Michael. We do include a member of the executive committee, so I don't know if Bruce or Emily, if either of you or Andy are interested.
I prefer the ordinance. I'm on the ordinance committee now. I think I want to stay there.
Okay,
I could serve on this one. Bruce, if you want to, you're welcome, but otherwise I could serve on this.
You're, go right ahead.
Okay.
and Alex, I saw your hand. Are you nominating yourself as well?
I guess I am. I don't think that's not great form, is it? But I traded with Emily for ordinance committee like 2 years ago. We have.
If you
yet
want
to
it back, I'll
have-
trade back with you. If you like,
I'm good with long range.
anybody wants it.
We have yet to have a meeting since I've been on that committee.
Yeah.
Well, we have 2 new long-range planning projects coming up this year, so
Ooh,
be ready, Alex.
exciting.
When they do,
We'll
it's
be
really
bi-
important.
We'll be busy this year.
Well. All right, so I'm hearing Michael, Alex, and Andy as the members of Long Range Committee. That sounds correct?
Sounds right.
All those in favor? Aye, I guess. All right. All right, and then our final committee is ordinance. So this also includes 1 member of our executive committee and 2 at-large members. You do also typically include a member from DRB and DAB. You do have a representative, Jack Quayle, I think is a new member of the DAB who has volunteered to participate on that committee. And again, we'll get a DRB volunteer for you once they've had their organizational meeting. So, any nominations for ordinance committee members?
Maybe we should hear who's interested. I think Emily is.
Yeah, I'd like to stay on ordinance.
I think it really comes down to that. You want to do some spade work with the ordinance. Sounds like it's Emily and
Are you interested in continuing, Bruce? Okay, Bruce is interested in continuing on the ordinance as well. Has
Are you-
anybody heard from Eves? I think Eves is the other member of the ordinance committee right now. We can
Has
also
he-
appoint, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
If he's interested, certainly, I mean, I would be, welcome him to stay on. We also have a 7th member of the planning commission that's going to be joining us at some point soon, I would imagine.
This is
So, we could wait to hear from Eves to see if he's interested before we do the final appointment.
That sounds fine. Why don't we move ahead with just the 2 for now? Or Alex, did you have a suggestion?
I was going to say if Eves is no longer interested in ordinance, I would be willing to rejoin that body.
Okay. Do we want to wait to, well, we're hopefully having a meeting of the ordinance committee next week. So why don't we move ahead at least with the 2 people we're definite about? If that's okay with this group, and then we can follow up with Eves about his interest as well.
Well,
Go ahead,
Alex, would
or
you like
Michael.
to join the ordinance committee?
I'm waiting.
Okay. Because,
Thank, I've been there before.
okay.
All right.
Thanks.
So then we'll move forward with a vote to appoint Emily and Bruce at this time to the ordinance committee. All those in favor?
Aye.
All right, that looks unanimous. So we'll follow up. Oh, I should have also said, and to appoint Jack Clayley to the ordinance committee. Apologies. All those in favor of adding Jack from the DAB? Couple people. Okay, great. All right, we'll move forward with that for you to schedule your meeting next week, and we'll follow up at a future meeting about the third member for the ordinance committee. And I
Great.
believe that concludes.
Thank you, Megan. Anytime you need me to fill in on your job, just let me know.
Okay. What are you doing tomorrow?
I'm busy, sorry.
Okay.
Okay, so we're on to item 8, which is proposed CDO amendment UVM Trinity campus zoning.
Okay. So in your packet, we had included some information that had been shared at some of your previous meetings. Today, we did provide some updated documents for the Trinity campus zoning discussion in the revised packet. So I'm going to go ahead and actually share my screen for this discussion so that we can walk through this together. This is a first draft of text amendments to the Trinity campus overlay zone that incorporates or I should say addresses some of the questions and requests for changes that you received from UVM. And then 3 of the 4 topics that staff had raised as additional discussion items. So we are continuing to do some research on the question about some of the master planning elements, and we'll talk about that with you at a future meeting. So actually, before I start sharing my screen, before I share the text amendments, let me walk through a couple slides that I put together that I think actually help summarize this a little bit more quickly. All right, so this table is a summary of the text amendments that you will see in the ordinance language that was included in the updated packet. These are the main standards that are included in the Trinity campus overlay and are the issues that we've talked about in the few conversations that we've had in previous meetings about these changes. So the first is addressing the questions that are sort of interrelated, the questions of building height and setback. In the ordinance today, building height is limited to 35 feet or as tall as the tallest existing structure, or a total of 55 feet max. The request that we've been talking about in terms of changing the building height is really tied to the setback issue, but includes a staggered building height limit. 45 feet closer to Colchester Avenue, and I have a diagram that will show what this means, and 80 feet beyond the existing setback line, that existing buffer that we have from Colchester Avenue. These numbers look different from what we've talked about before, just because we're trying to be responsive to the request that Andy made about how to be more transparent about where the setback is measured from. The kind of corresponding piece of this is the change to those setbacks. The biggest change you'll see is instead of a prohibition on any kind of development being within that 115-foot buffer, there's a shallower buffer proposed that would allow buildings up to 45 feet in height, but the taller buildings would have to still exist beyond that buffer. You will see an update to the standard for lot coverage within the Trinity campus overlay area. We've talked a little bit about density and that there are current limits on density for this campus. The draft language that you'll see will exempt dormitories and institutional housing units from that density limit in order to help us achieve that goal of housing as many students on campus as can reasonably be achieved. The Trinity campus overlay currently prohibits new surface parking lots. That continues to be in the ordinance. But we did note that in the current standards for Trinity parking garages, so structured parking is not a permitted use on the campus. So we have included that for your consideration as an allowable use. We did make some tweaks to how the uses are permitted on the campus for our discussion at our last meeting. So those uses that had been limited to existing buildings are permitted on the campus, regardless of whether they're in new or existing buildings. And then the final piece is the Trinity campus currently has a lower threshold for when developments have to go through the major impact review process, and the draft changes remove that, which means that any development on this campus would have to go through the major impact in the same way that any institutional project does. So a couple quick things to follow up on those before we get into the weeds. We included this graphic in your agenda packet in an effort to try to provide some additional, or to bring a bunch of different information together on the same map for you. We've been talking about a lot of different lines that sort of exist in space that you can't actually see on the ground if you were to be walking on or by the Trinity campus. So we tried to, and thanks to Charles and Sarah's help, we tried to provide all this information together on one graphic for you. I'm going to zoom in on this for a second here, because some of these lines that are closest to Colchester Avenue are the ones that we have talked the most about. So this lime green polygon that you see is actually the parcel, the Trinity campus parcel that we've been talking about, and the portion of the parcel that's in the Trinity campus overlay zoning district. So whenever we have talked about measuring a setback, we're always talking about measuring it from that lime green line along Colchester Avenue, which is different from where the sidewalk on Colchester Avenue is, which is that pink line that you can see there. It says edge of sidewalk. So whenever we have been talking about UVM's request for a 25-foot setback, this is the orange line that we're looking at. And you can see that, you know, when we measure it from the setback line and the sidewalk line together, it adds up to about 40 feet from the sidewalk. The purple line shows the existing buffer, which is where any new development is limited on the campus today. And if you look, both the orange and the purple lines extend as a dotted line off to the east of the Trinity campus, just so you can see as reference where these setback lines, how they relate to the neighboring properties. There was a question at the meeting last week about, you know, what does this setback, this proposed change to the setback mean in relation to the kind of residential properties that are on either side of the Trinity campus? Many of the properties that are immediately to the east of Trinity campus along Colchester Avenue are pretty close to the street. They're more in line of, you know, 15 or 20 feet from the sidewalk. So you can see that a 40-foot setback from the sidewalk would actually mean that new buildings on Trinity campus would be set back a bit further than some of those existing properties. And on the opposite side of the street, the residential buildings on Colchester Avenue range anywhere from about 15 to 30 or so feet setback from the sidewalk on the south side of the street. So just helps give us some reference in terms of how these setbacks could relate to some of the neighboring properties. Let's skip over this for a second. The other thing I wanted to revisit, you've seen these before, but I think somebody asked for them to just be shared again so that we could see kind of what that means, what that looks like in a more photorealistic way. So these are some renderings that UVM has shared in the past about the concepts so that you can see what it might look like if you were walking or driving down Colchester Avenue, how that 40-foot setback on the Trinity campus side of the street relates to where the houses are on the lots on the south side of the street, and kind of how the proposed 45-foot building height relates as well. So this is one image you've seen, and these are the other images you've seen, just comparing these changes to the setback and heights of some of the newer construction on Bedstone campus. This is a new graphic here. This is attempting to illustrate these setbacks just one more way, if they're helpful for clarification. So this is, if folks are familiar with a section drawing, this is an image that UVM also shared, which is essentially, taking the Trinity campus from north to south, and if you sliced it down the middle and we were looking at that sort of slice of the property, what it looks like. So again, starting with the pink lines, these are the existing kind of limits of Colchester Avenue, the sort of built street that we're familiar with and could see on the ground today. The green lines are where the property starts. So it's set back from the back of the sidewalk, as we've talked about. As we move into the orange line, this is the proposed setback that would be 25 feet behind that property line. And then we have the existing 115-foot buffer. So when we talk about the proposed changes to both the height and setback, what we're really talking about is what's happening kind of between the pink and orange lines, and then between the orange and purple lines. So between the pink and orange lines, we would continue to not allow development to encroach in that setback. And then between the orange and purple lines, the current ordinance would allow buildings up to 45 feet in height. And then beyond the purple line, buildings up to 80 feet in height. So just a couple more ways to visualize what we've been talking about. And then I'll wrap up with, there was a question at the last meeting as well about major impact review standards. So this is a quick excerpt. It's not actually very quick, and there are a lot of bullets here, but this is an excerpt of our major impact standards that the DRB would look at for projects that are required to be reviewed under this part of the ordinance. At our last meeting, we talked a little bit about, not knowing what the right threshold might be for requiring major impact review, or I think Bruce even asked the question about whether major impact should be required for development in this area. All of the institutional zoning districts, so all the other parts of campus, and medical center and Champlain College, are in the major impact threshold category that requires the review if 25 or more housing units are being built, or 40,000 square foot of gross building area, mixed use, non-residential building area. And these are the standards that the DRB would review for a project.
How is a housing unit defined? Is it 2-beds or?
A housing unit is defined in our ordinance as including everything, area for sleeping, cooking, and bathing, or something, I think is how it's defined. So it doesn't care how many bedrooms are part of a housing unit, it counts a unit as a unit.
So a dorm would be limited by or would trigger at 40,000 square feet.
There's actually a separate standard in our ordinance that for things that are not considered a full housing unit, like a dorm, that every 4 beds counts as a housing unit. Yep. So in this case, 100 dorm beds. Yeah. Yeah. So these are the thresholds that apply to other areas of campus. Obviously, for Trinity campus, there are lower thresholds when this review would apply. So the draft that we sent to you just makes the Trinity campus consistent with other areas of campus in terms of when this review would be required. All right, so I will stop sharing this. And I'll actually stop sharing my screen for just a second to see if anybody has any comments or questions about any of that before we dive in.
Emily?
Myself. So first of all, I'm really mad about that photo with the picture of the car parked in the bike lane that we keep seeing every single time. Like, who parks in a bike lane? But I do want to just, like, as we're looking at the setback pictures and thinking about where these buildings should be, what keeps coming to my mind is that I think we're approaching it from the perspective of what it's like to approach the city in a car, right? Because we're saying we want it set back from the street so much because we don't want the building imposing on the street. But that's something you access from a car. That's a thoroughfare that goes through the city. And I guess I encourage everybody to orient yourselves more to the walked experience and thinking that possibly having the building oriented closer to the street and more in line with the rest of the development on that street and just being cohesive to the current development plan may open up opportunities for there to be some really lovely green space behind the building that people who live in Burlington are actually going to enjoy. And it's going to be more like a campus. And maybe, like, you know, there will be a walking path or a bike path that cuts through that area that everyday people will enjoy as their way of transportation around the city, instead of having that experience of the green space be shoved between a major busy street and a tall building. So again, I personally think that the building should be closer to the street in order to give more room for space behind the building that's actually going to be accessed by, you know, the neighborhoods that are back there. And I guess, again, challenge everybody to think about what perspective you're viewing this from. Like, the street is about a car experience. It's about driving a car into the city, entering and exiting quickly one time.
Thank you. Let me just put one other thought out there, a question to everybody. It was suggested to us by, I can't remember if it was Sharon or Barbara, it might have been somebody else, that we do a site visit, that we actually go down there and look around and walk around. Is that something that folks are interested in doing?
Sure.
We've done before sometimes. We often don't, but we have done that before. So,
You know, Andy, I think that's a really, really good idea. I mean, I think a lot of the buildings on the site are going to be historic and hard to add additions to. I think it'll give us some understanding. I'd also like to say Emily's comment, I think, is spot on. In other setback area, in other setback definitions in our ordinance, we try to make it consistent with the rest of the street to mostly for the walking experience. And in this case, we don't. And I think we also inadvertently limit flexibility in design by taking away that 40 feet, or if we do something less of that, it might give more flexibility, provide for more interesting buildings.
I have to say, I agree entirely with Emily about the car-centric perspective and, you know, having some more flexibility to create some green space rather than just a lawn in front of a building next to a street. I just have to say, Megan and whoever created those graphics, I really appreciate the creation and inclusion of those. Those were very helpful. And I imagine that other people will appreciate those too. I don't recall who asked for them, but thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to Charles and Sarah for spinning those up for us. They're really helpful.
Yeah.
So it looked like there is an interest in doing a site visit to be able to walk that area. Megan, Charles, is that something you could help set up so we could do that?
Yeah, that sounds like a great plan.
Yeah, we can also be in touch with UVM as well, who can see if they can join us for that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments? So Megan, what at this point, I see Sharon wants to speak. So let me just ask you a question and then come to Sharon, because I did tell her she could speak during this. Megan, where are we going from here? I mean, I know this has been in front of us for a while. We've had a lot of discussion about it, but where do we go from here?
So this is the first time you're seeing ordinance language that reflects the requests that you've heard for changes to the zoning, as well as kind of attempts to capture things that we've talked about. So given that it just came to you, I think if you would like, I can walk you through it very briefly. We are not asking for any action tonight. We will be following up with you on some additional pieces of this at a future meeting. But really, we wanted for you all to start to become familiar with how this translates into ordinance language.
Great, thanks for that clarification. Let's go to Sharon, and then when I come back, I'm going to just see if folks want Megan to walk through it for us. Michael, do you want to speak, or do you want to get to Sharon?
Sharon can speak. I just had a question on the red lines.
Okay, let's go to Sharon, and then we'll come back to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank the commission for being willing to do a site visit. I think that some of the suggestions I think are interesting ones, but I think once you see the size of the campus, I think some of the proposals of green space, et cetera, you will see some of the challenges. And that's what I want you to see, is the campus as it is and what the potential and what the obstacles are. So thank you for that. And the other piece that I wanted to reference was that I walk. I don't drive around my ward that I live in. I walk, and I feel that the walking experience also is one that gives you. I feel I don't like feeling claustrophobic. So I guess if I'm downtown, there are businesses that I want to engage with. I feel fine about having those close to the sidewalk. But when I'm coming out of the downtown, I don't feel the same way. And so I just want to share that with you. I wanted to also let you know that this old dog can change her mind. And I think that Lisa Kingsbury made a statement about once you measure the distance from the sidewalk, et cetera, it's not 25 feet, it's 40 feet. And, you know, I had wanted 45. I think 40 feet is fine. That is that. And I know that's not where you're thinking about right now, but I think I just wanted to go on record saying I think 40 feet is fine. I do want to mention that the reason that as you bring that line down that Megan did with the map, the reason the houses are built closer to the street, I wasn't there in the 1800s, but the reason they were built closer to the street is that the ravine comes way up. And I lived at 278 Colchester Avenue, and there was a ravine right behind my backyard. So if you didn't put the house close to the street, you wouldn't have had a house because there was a very small backyard. So I think that you need to think about the topography too. There were rationales for why things are the way they are. And once again, those are small homes versus these larger structures. And my suggestion still is, and Lisa Kingsbury said the houses at on Prospect were actually, what did she say? They were 40 feet, not 35, as I had said. The Redstone Apartments, once again, 40 feet in my communication is one of the other things that I see that's better than 45 feet. I think that incrementally, I want this to be successful. I want this housing just as much as everybody else does, but this is long-term and I want it to be done right. And that's really the spirit behind what I'm saying. I'm not trying to be obstinate or difficult. I'm just trying to get it right so that the neighborhood feels good and UVM can thrive and survive and we can have more housing. So I'm not going to go through all the other points in the communication, but I hope you will look at them, especially regarding parking. I do agree that I don't want more surface parking there, but I think we need to be, I don't know who uses that parking. That's part of the questions that I raise. I think those would be germane because one of the things I said in my communication is I think that, you know, grad students and people may or may not have cars and they may or may not want cars close to where they live. I don't want to deter the success of having people come out of our neighborhoods and into this new housing. I want us to be able to be smart about how UVM, what we provide for UVM so that the housing is occupied and we actually feel some relief in the community. So thank you again. I know I rambled, but thank you again for listening.
Thank you, Sharon. Michael, I know you had some comments or questions.
Yeah, Megan into it. First, just quickly reiterate, I think they're probably, I agree with Emily's comment about the setbacks generally, but I think that's been well established. The question I had was for Megan. We had talked about something that resembles a you know, some form of the institutional parking management plan, but like a supply and demand analysis on housing as part of this, which I think sort of threads the needle on what some community members were asking and council was asking for as we consider this, and just wanted to see if we had any ideas out there as we consider these amendments.
Yeah, and that was one of the areas that I had mentioned that we'll follow up on with some specific ideas for language about in an upcoming meeting. So there are a couple of areas that we're researching just in terms of how this relates to other parts of the ordinance and sections of state statute that we're just looking into. So we want to make sure that we have kind of the right recommendation for how to approach that when we put it in front of you. So definitely still on our radar.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Sorry if I missed that before.
Oh, no, that's okay. So I think then the main thing that I wanted to just talk through, I think as you, oh, go ahead, Emily.
I just had one other question or comment about the setbacks. And I hope, Sharon, that you'll come on the walkthrough with us on the site visit, because I think you have so much to offer with just living in that neighborhood and your experience of the area. But I'm also interested, there's some bigger buildings on that street, like the medical center, the old medical college, I guess, that's on the corner. And then I'm thinking about like Fleming Museum and like just taking a bigger look at other big structures that are on the building in that thoroughfare and what are their setbacks. Because I know the medical college is set right on the street. You know, I know it's further in, closer to campus, and that's a pretty tall building. So anyways, that's just a thought.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we can, you know, we put that graphic together, kind of zeroed in a little bit closer to the Trinity campus area. We can do a couple measurements for you in terms of other buildings along Colchester Avenue. I would say just a quick kind of visual, like looking at an aerial of the building you're talking about at the corner of like Colchester and Prospect, is that right?
Yeah, that's right on the corner and right on the floor there. And then there are some other bigger buildings as you get closer, like bigger old Victorians and structures that are pretty close.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in that area, especially the old medical college building, is probably somewhere around like a 40 to 60 foot setback from the actual sidewalk, but we can look into that more specifically. So.
Oh.
Go ahead,
Andy, can I
Michael.
ask a quick question? Is the new, we're talking about setbacks, and so I did have a follow-up question. Was the new improved sort of bike path there that's on the other side of the street from Trinity, but up the street, is that in the right of way or is that on UVM's land? Because I think that's relevant also.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I wonder, Charles, if you wanted to let Lisa Kingsbury, if you would enable her mic. I'm going to ask Lisa if she knows right off the top of her head.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I was actually also looking at the distance for Dewey.
The new shared use path that's on the south side of Colchester Avenue by the medical center, is that on UVM property or is that in the city's right of way?
I believe all of that is in the city's right of way.
Okay, I thought so, but I just wanted to confirm with you, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is a pretty wide right of way, as we've talked about, you know, again, the difference between where those lime green lines show up on the ground, there is a pretty significant amount of public space, public city-owned land on the sides of the street itself, where the sidewalks exist and even further behind the sidewalks before you actually get to the property line. So on the topic of setbacks, I think, and this is relevant to the issue we were just discussing, since you all have the ordinance language, I'll just flag this one area for you as you are kind of looking through it in anticipation of our next discussion. So one of the questions that Andy had asked at our last meeting was how we could write this setback in a way that provides some more transparency for what we're talking about. Whenever we talk about distances from the sort of sidewalk that people are comfortable with, it sounds like there is consensus forming around the sort of 40 feet from the sidewalk as a general range. But because of where the property line is located, the way that the ordinance language would be structured would actually say that that setback is only 25 feet. So we just talked about how that's very confusing. So we looked into the ordinance and other areas of the ordinance at different opportunities for how this setback could be expressed. And this language is actually structured to establish the setback from the center line of Colchester Avenue. So the kind of, you can imagine the yellow lines down the middle of the street. So using that as the measurement point. And again, the same numbers we've been talking about, just a different way of measuring them. So this establishes that kind of initial setback as being 65 feet from the center line of Colchester Avenue. And then that existing 115-foot setback we have today, that buffer we have today, would actually be written as 155 feet from the center line. So just so you know, as you're looking through this, what these numbers mean. The 65 feet is that orange line that I showed you on the graphics, and the 150 feet is the purple line that we showed you on the graphics. So that's how we're proposing to address this, just to help kind of clarify this issue a little bit. We didn't choose, from the curb or from the sidewalk as the measurement standard because the Colchester Avenue corridor plan has a number of improvements that could be made in this area. So curbs and paths could potentially be rebuilt and moved. So we wanted to establish a number that was a little bit more permanent as a measuring point. So you'll see that here in the ordinance. And then again, the thing that's tied to that setback is the height. So you'll see the 65 and 155 feet here in the height section then again, in terms of where those different heights are allowed. And I don't think anything else in here will be a surprise to you based on our discussions and on that summary table that I shared. There are a couple of questions in this chart about uses that could be allowed, particularly non-residential uses that could be allowed, that you can think about. Whether lodging uses should be allowed on this part of the campus. They've already been permitted in the past, so there's a question about whether we want to continue to do that. And then there are a couple of these sort of minor in nature retail uses like a barber shop or a laundromat that are very much in the spirit of the kinds of uses we've been talking about. that weren't previously contemplated in the Trinity campus overlay before. So just a couple things for you to think about there. I think with that, I will, I'll stop sharing, Andy, and if there are any final questions?
Any questions from anyone? So I don't see any now. So I think part of what we'll be doing is scheduling a site visit. So we could all, look at that part of the campus and help us inform our decisions of what we do. Good. All right. Thank you, Megan. So we'll close out. Any questions, Megan, from you on what we're doing? Kind of
Any
backwards,
questions
because I know you're helping. Yeah, I know you're looking to us, but
No, I think, as I said before, just trying to provide you with actual zoning language that supports the conversations we've been having up to this point, so.
okay, great. Thank you. Then we'll close out that item and move on to commissioner items. When is our next meeting?
Is it in your agenda packet? I think it's on August 9th.
Okay,
That's right. It is August 9th.
great. Thank you. Anyone else? Any other commissioner items? All right, then we'll close that and move on to item 10, which is minutes and communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept the communications that were in our packet? Alex, you're on mute, but I could read your lips. That's exactly what you're saying.
Thank you, Andy, for divining my intent to accept the minutes and the communication.
And is second
I
by
Yes, yeah.
Emily. Any further discussion? See none, all those in favor of the motion for the minutes and communication, say aye, raise your hand. Any opposed? We have our minutes and communications, and last item is adjournment. So motion to adjourn, motion by Emily and seconded by Michael. All those in favor of adjournment, raise your hand or say aye. We
I
stand adjourned. Thank you all. Have a nice evening. Take care.
Thank you. That was like the greatest hits of zoning topics, so thanks
Yeah,
for your
really.
Yeah, that was a lot.
attention.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, bye, good night.
I think CMSA